IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host, Shrikrishna Upadhyaya. And in yesterday's episode of All Things Policy, we spoke about the Punjab and Haryana High Court's decision striking down the local reservation law passed by the Haryana government. I had my colleague Saurabh Todi on the show and we spoke at length about the legal implications of this decision. Today, to give us gyan from an economic perspective, I have with me my colleague and Professor of Economics at Takshashila Institution, Anupam Manur, joining me. Glad to have you on All Things Policy, Anupam.
Hi, Sri. Glad to be here.
So like I mentioned, we're going to be delving into the issue of local reservation in the private sector in great detail and analyzing the multiple economic causes beyond such a populist move. As also, we're going to be talking about some general issues regarding economic freedom in the country and the union of states and the problem in terms of barriers to trade between different states in the country. So having said that, Anupam, just to recap, what we are talking about is a law passed by the Haryana government, which reserved 75% of the jobs in private sectors, paying less than 30,000 per month to local candidates, right? And local candidates were defined as people who have a domicile in the state of Haryana. Punjab and Haryana High Court found this faulty. They held this to be unconstitutional. They said it violates a bunch of your fundamental rights, including the right to movement and right to settlement of workers, as well as the right to trade, business and occupation of the employers, that is the private sector industries. So that's the short recap. So Anupam, what are your broad thoughts on this whole issue, your initial comments?
My initial comment is that this was an extremely idiotic policy move, and I'm extremely glad that the law got struck down. That's a top-level analysis. Not even analysis, maybe diatribe. But I think, this is an increasingly familiar sort of legislation passed. Haryana, as I think, I was trying to tell you that it's by no means the only state which has done that.
Right.
In fact, we can look at this in the slightly positive side, saying that it is only the Haryana's law which got struck down.
Yeah.
There are many other laws which are actually existing now, right? I think Karnataka has already reserved or done something of this sort, saying 75%. Maharashtra has something on 80%. Andhra Pradesh has some, again, law which mandates 75%. Madhya Pradesh 70%, etc. And all of this with luckily very little success,
right.
Because enforcement of it is a nightmare. You can't really enforce it, and we'll come back to that, right? You can't enforce it without having a large state machinery which will have to do regular checks, which will have to do proper definition, and that will lead to the classic Inspector Raj. We'll talk about that later, but so therefore it's not been successful. Yet such laws exist, and such laws existing itself is a problem, right? So Haryana's law got struck down, but it's by no means the end of this entire episode. I think it's merely a pause, a lucky pause, because just as that was happening, I think Kerala released a draft IT policy, and that had a whole bunch of other things on black box for this thing. How do we do regulation? Whole bunch of I've not read that in great detail, but this again caught my eye, where they said we're going to provide special incentives to companies who are investing in the IT sector and who will reserve 50% of jobs for Keralites. And that immediately for me was a red flag, because IT does not work by promoting this thing. In fact, you look at the parallels, right? Bangalore, for example, the great success of Bangalore as a IT hub has been because of migration. Right. You can never take that away. Every time I have an argument with my uncles, who are, by the way, I'm Bangalorean and, I have my entire family lives here, etc. Yeah. And so my uncles who say, Bangalore in the 80s was so golden. But they're now enjoying the benefits of that migration, right? People have come in, they've created large amounts of money, they've created large amounts of employment opportunities, they've created large amounts of just economic activity, right?
Correct.
And that has benefited everybody.
Yeah.
So and Mumbai has, traditionally been the hub for migration. Delhi has been the hub for migration. These are success stories, right?
Yeah.
So I think on that front as well, this is a highly, it's a flawed policy to say that we will encourage people to only hire locals. So
Right.
I'm glad it got struck down, but this is merely, as I said, it's not even a full stop. It's a comma in this entire saga.
Right. No, but of course, this might be very unpopular in policy domains which you and I belong to, but clearly this is very popular. Otherwise, politicians wouldn't be out there making such promises, right? And this, of course, is based on this rather simplistic notion that, oh, migrants who are outsiders are coming and stealing our jobs. And this has been there for like the longest time in India. Earlier, we had this whole issue in regarding Biharis in Mumbai and so on. And now it seems like, states which are more prosperous, say the southern states or states like Haryana, where there is a large amount of migrant labor coming in from poorer states, say Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Bengal, Bihar, and so on, there is somehow this perception that the outsiders are coming and taking away our jobs, right? This may be flawed, but again, in politics, a simplistic explanation to a complex problem always carries a lot of weight.
Correct.
But in this nice piece that you've written for Money Control after this judgment came out, and I'll be plugging this to the show notes, you write that opposition to migration falls into the lump of labor fallacy. A belief that there is a limited number of jobs available and therefore a migrant is taking away a local's job. In fact, the opposite is true. Migration leads to increased economic activity, which leads to more job creation. I think you alluded to this in your opening comments, but I sort of want you to elaborate more on this and sort of place the role of migration in India's economic growth and development.
I'll actually start off with maybe a bigger kind of global role, right? Because this is not unique to India.
Yeah.
This is not unique to Haryana. This is not unique to Kerala. This is happening the world over. In fact, I would go so far to say that Trump and Boris Johnson and the entire Brexit was all a violent, almost in policy circles, a violent reaction to immigration.
Yeah.
Right. So Brexit was exactly this. You were saying that, there are migrants who are coming from Eastern Europe who are coming and taking away the locals' jobs. They said that, these Indian doctors come and give such good treatment with at lower pay. I mean, they should have been thankful, but that's what they were opposing. Right. So this is not new, this is not unique, and this is not that just in terms of geography, but it's also you can apply it across domains. It's not just that the migrant is taking away jobs, but it is that technology is taking away jobs, right? And then it's not just happening in 2023, but when computers first came in, everybody was afraid of the same thing, that computers are taking away jobs. Or similarly, when, for example, the first time a car was produced, everybody said it's going to take away the horse.
Yeah. And now we have it with the AI.
Exactly, right? So you see this throughout. And this is what you'd call as a lump of labor fallacy, which is, very simply put, it's to assume that there is a fixed number of jobs. There are 1,000 jobs, and that 1,000 jobs is what we do. And so therefore, if a migrant comes in and does one job, then that is one job less for locals, right? Or if a computer comes and takes away 10 jobs, then that is 10 jobs away less for, the people who are working. But in fact, that's not quite how it happens, right? Now, look at, okay, let's deal with the tech part of it first and then come to the more relevant aspects to our conversation today. But we've seen, right? Computers have come. Yes, they've taken away, let's say, clerical jobs or manual data entry into paper or whatever. Yes, that has taken it away, but it has created 100 other different kind of jobs, right? You have now software engineers, you have people who maintain those computers, you have people who produce those computers, you have people who, whatever, right?
Fair,
A whole bunch of things. So the idea is that higher productivity or things which will lead to higher productivity doesn't necessarily take away jobs. It will create greater, bigger, better jobs, and that will generate income, and that income itself will create more demand for other products, and that will create jobs. So similarly, you look at, for example, what's happened in Bangalore, right? So Bangalore has been, not just because I stay there, but I also love it because of its cosmopolitan nature. People have always been welcome in Bangalore. Yes, the the headline that people say is the weather, but it's actually the fact that you can come in here, you can find a job, and it's nice for outsiders to come and settle down, right? And how does that actually play out? You got migrants who come in, right? And they get a job. Now they get jobs at fairly high kind of salaries because these are jobs at the IT sector and so on. Now, similarly, it also works for construction workers. For example, traditionally Bangalore construction workers have been Tamilians, right? Now, once there was greater prosperity in Tamil Nadu, greater industry, etc., that stopped coming in. Then you had Bihar, people coming from Bihar, and then you had NREGA and so on, where Bihar this thing, and now you're seeing that you actually have lesser labor. It's not that the Biharis were stealing away Bangalorean jobs, because a native Bangalorean wouldn't do that construction job, by the way. Right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of other things that go into it, but that's the way that it was playing out. But anyway, leave that aside for the moment. Let's look at whatever the IT jobs, etc., right? Or even higher paying jobs. It's people come in, they do those jobs, they get higher salary. Then what do they do with that higher salary? It's not that they're sending all that money back. Right? Some of it is sent back, some of it is spent, some of it is saved, some of it is this thing, right? But the fact that there's more money in circulation creates jobs. It creates demand. It boosts aggregate demand, right? And that will create more jobs by itself. So you've got to think of this as migration actually leads to greater economic activity, which actually results in greater job creation. And greater job creation up and down the stream, by the way, that creates greater jobs for example, cooks. We've seen that a lot of people have shifted away from cooking at home to having a cook at home, domestic help. It could be nannies, it could be something else. So it creates jobs.
Right. No, that's very interesting. And it's, of course, a little counterintuitive that, we think in simplistic terms that migrants will come and steal away your jobs. But like you rightly pointed out, it's rather the opposite. They create more job and more prosperity and economic activity and so on. But coming to a bit of a specifics on this Haryana law, right? So this did not apply to, say, your tech workers or higher paid employees, right? I mean, they were very clear. You can come and work in Gurgaon even if you're from anywhere in the country. But if you're going to be in Gurgaon and working at a job which pays less than 30,000, then, hey, no, that's not allowed, right? So it was clearly targeted at a particular set of jobs, right? I was just wondering, like, what was the thinking behind this? Is it like an incentive policy of the Haryana government to ensure that private sector starts paying people more than 30,000 rupees just so that they can escape the clutches of this law? Is it like Manrega in reverse? So what was it?
No, I don't think they had thought that much. I think it was still a populist policy, but what you alluded to could very well be a happy unintended consequence, right? But I think, their thinking is that they saw the benefits of high-end migration, right? Which is that, software or whatever else coming to Gurgaon and working, they didn't mind that because they understood that creates jobs. But they felt that, at the lower scale of the income spectrum, people coming from outside and doing, let's say, whatever manual labor it could be, or what it was detrimental, let's say factory assembly work, right? That they didn't want it to be taken away from them. Now, having said that, I can still carry on with a fair degree of confidence, still carry on with the same argument that I did. Even a person, let's say, earning 25,000 who's a migrant, the lump of labor fallacy still is persisting, right? Because even a person working and getting 25,000 still spends that money, right? If they're getting only 25,000, they're not going to expatriate it or take that money out of the system. In fact, that money will be in the system, and that creates more number of jobs for the locals. That's part A. But part B, I think, you're very well. I mean, part B is just that, two things will happen. Either the happy scenario is where they'll start paying extra, but that'll happen at the margin. As in, somebody who's getting 29K, you'll bump it up to 30K and then think of other ways to take it away or something. But I think what will happen is that you will have more informal work. You'll have more contract labor. You're saying, okay, these are people who have not hired, but these are people who are contract labor. So I think you're going to witness negative or an unfortunate consequence. Unfortunately, not the happy one, but you're going to see people moving more into the contract labor.
No, but of course, I think there is a real problem behind this as well, right? And you write about this. You talk about unemployment, and you in fact feel that there is a lot of pressure on the politicians of Haryana to bring in such a measure because the locals over there are facing severe unemployment, and they believe this can be some sort of a panacea, and they can, because for them, their immediate need is to get a job, right? It's not about thinking of the second order effects of migration and so on, right? So how much role do you think unemployment plays in, governments coming up with policies like this?
Massively. And fair warning, I'm going to give you a long and winded answer, but I see we've had a problem with unemployment all the way from, I would say, since independence, and it's come out in many different forms and factors and so on, right? But every single episode of demand for reservation has been because of unemployment. I think the thinking on this is very simple and I think logically consistent, which is that only when you have a dearth of resources, only when you have a massive scarcity of resources, do you have such struggle for those resources, right? And so, when you have a famine, for example, or famine is extreme, when you have, for whatever reason, shortage of, let's say, food, that is when you have to employ an elaborate system of, let's say, rationing, right?
Yeah.
When you need to ration out that food, when you need to divide and this thing, and then there's going to be political maneuvering. We understand this, right? So, for example, even in the US, when you had the war effort going on and you had massive shortages of food and other essential supply, that's when the US also employed kind of rationing system. They employed, for example, price controls. All of that is emblematic of a deeper structural problem, which is shortages, right? So similarly, I think in India, we've had problems with employment in the earlier period just because we didn't have good high economic growth. For whatever reason, in 60s and 70s, we went through the entire socialist method and so on. And so therefore, we achieved just about 3 to 4% of GDP. That did not result in high economic growth. And so then we went the other way around. We also put in lots and lots of, very strict labor laws. We had, some of those crazy kind of labor laws, unions.
Capital controls and all that.
High, strong unions everywhere dictating. All of that led to massive unemployment throughout the country. That unemployment resulted, demands for reservation. So whether you look at, I'm going to make controversial statements here, but, the Mandal Commission, all of that, right? The Mandal Committee and therefore the resulting this thing was a result of unemployment. It's a deeply economic problem at its root, right? And then you jump 10 years and so on. In the 2000s, we had high economic growth. Right, we had 9%, 8% economic growth consistently, but unfortunately, we had what you would call as jobless growth.
Yeah.
Right, we had high economic growth, but not corresponding high job growth. And the figures bear out. In fact, now just to introduce a technical term, there's something called the employment elasticity of growth. That is, for 1% increase in GDP, how much does job growth grow? And in that period between 2003 and 2007, the employment elasticity was 0.1, which is for 1% GDP growth, you would have less than 1.1% growth in jobs, right? Which is abysmal. So that tells you that we've had a very poor record of job creation and employment generation in India. Now, how does this manifest? If you ask me, that the manifestation of this in India is not straightforward. You don't have people out on the street saying we want jobs. Sometimes maybe you do, but you actually get this in the form of two things. One, you get, when you have large scale unemployment, you get, and especially youth unemployment, which is also the case in India, you get people, what happens when you have a large number of young people who are unemployed?
Social tension.
Yeah. You have, at the root of it, you have, social discord, you have, a fall of harmony and all of those things, right? Because you have young people who are unemployed. Yeah. So they will go ahead and they will get, caught up in a whole bunch of things. So your lynchings, your whatever, whole bunch of those things that happen, right, is a result of unemployment. If you have a 9-to-5 job, I don't think you'll go out there and say, oh, wait, I care about that guy eating something and so therefore I'm going to go lynch, right? I mean, it can still happen, but I'm saying the proportion of that will be so much lower if you have a proper 9-to-5 job. Right? So you don't have that. So that is the first result. The second result is, as I said, the demand for reservations. Right? It could be caste reservation, it could be gender-based reservation, it could be some other based reservation, it could be now, as we are seeing it, domicile-based reservation. But that demand for reservation is a direct result of unemployment. Let me put this in one further this thing, right, into context, because now I'm not pulling all of this out of the hat. I was about to say something else, but wait, fine. Right? I'm not pulling this out of the hat, right? In India, unemployment right now is about 10%. It hovers usually about 7 to 8%. Now, you could say, okay, 7%, not so much. US has now unemployment rate of about 7%. But the bigger problem in India is the labor force participation rate, right? That is, how many people are either have a job or are actively looking for a job. And that is abysmally low in India. It's about 39.5% as of now, right? Which is lower than, any other comparable country. It's lower than Brazil, Argentina, whatever, right? A whole bunch of middle income countries that you can compare with. India's is extremely low. Forget about the high developed economies, etc.
Yeah.
So that is the reason why you have such reservations. So now when you have such a scarce commodity, which is a single job is an extremely scarce thing, right? The other way it manifests, we've seen in UP, for example, right, where you have whatever these sensational headlines, 650 PhDs apply for one single peon job.
Correct.
Or you have 100,000 whatever
For railway
applicants
jobs and
for
stuff.
like some 10 jobs,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
These are all manifestations of that underlying problem.
Yeah.
And so when you have a commodity which is as scarce, then the political economy kicks in, right? So now you have a politician which says, okay, there is this extremely scarce commodity, lots of people want it.
Yeah.
How can I use that to my advantage?
They look at it with the redistribution lens.
Right? They look at it from the redistribution lens. So if you can, now, unfortunately, in the public sector, you can't. I think you're better placed to speak about this. There are a bunch of rules which will stop you, but you can probably try and doing it, putting legislations to force private players to do it, and then go out there to your masses and say, elect me. I have delivered this. I have ensured that you get a job. I think that's where it is.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
No, I mean, your whole theory or rather rant on unemployment is well received. But Anupam, one of the structural reasons why we have such a jobless growth is also, like you point out, because of the rules, legislative framework which sort of govern our labor markets, and as well as, our generally which governs the domain of businesses, industries, and so on, right? And you talk of this in the sense of paucity of economic freedom. I think at the beginning you talked about how this Haryana law required every employer to give a quarterly report mentioning all the local candidates who have been employed, right, to an inspector or whoever this government official is. Similarly, it required all the candidates to get registered on a government portal, and the hiring will be done through that portal. And this law also had a provision which said that, in case you can prove to the government officer that the particular skilled labor is not available locally, then you may get an exemption from this law. All of this creates...
But you have to show that you're actually spending time on skilling people. By the way, there's some really crazy set of laws.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Which ultimately means another rent-seeking opportunity for the government and all. And you sort of alluded to the license inspector Raj, which, India had infamous periods of, right? And that seems to be coming back in some way or the other through such legislative measures. So my question to you broadly is on this paucity of economic freedom that you write about, right? Why is that the case? How does it affect us? How does it play a major role in unemployment and the consequent demand for reservation, as you put it?
Yeah. If our listeners had a drinking game where they would take a shot for every time I said labor laws on all things policy, I think we'd have a bunch of really inebriated listeners. But it's true. So when I spoke about the jobless growth and so on, right, the reason for that jobless growth was exactly this. Was that, you had a set of labor laws which was impossible to comply with, right? And irrespective of how much you tried, you would always find yourself non-compliant with the law, right? And you'd find yourself working in contradiction to the law. And if that was the case, you'd find that, companies said, okay, forget it. Let me just, even though it is far more expensive, even though, labor, for example, is abundant, I will still use up scarce capital and buy a machine. To do that laborer's job. So now you have that very peculiar scenario in India where you have a labor abundant country, right? But most firms in India are capital intensive, right? They prefer to just, go out and buy machinery rather than deal with this quagmire of labor laws. Okay, so that is part A. And I think you'd also have to put this in the context of just overall how difficult it is to do business, right? And we've spoken about this. We know this. There's an entire ease of doing business ranking, which has now been discredited, etc. But if you look at it from at the core principle, I think it still is very difficult to do business in India. And therefore you have this unemployment problem and so on. But I think you distill this, right? And for me, the core of this is the idea that there is a lack of economic freedom. Right? The Constitution of India gives us what personal freedom, they give us religious freedom, they give us political freedom, and they give us and it gives us like economic freedom, right? Now, in various ways, when you have, for example, I mean, I think all of this is trampled upon in some way or the other. I don't think I need to mention that religious freedom in India right now is probably at its lowest point. I think political freedom, again, you have comedians getting locked up, and you have journalists being attacked, and ED raids on somebody else, etc. So I think political freedom, freedom of speech, all of that is in various ways under threat. But I think as an economist, I would say that at least there is, a lot of brouhaha being created about some of these things happening. At least you have, some media saying, our political freedom is going away, etc. But economic freedom is trampled upon every single day with carefree abandon by the state, with nobody even recognizing it to be as such.
There's no constituency which speaks for it.
Right? There's nobody. I'll tell you this, right? Nobody stands up for economic freedom. Businesses love, because they're incumbents, they want economic freedom to be taken away, because they don't want somebody else coming and starting up a business which will threaten their business, right? So the business community doesn't speak up, government doesn't speak up, ordinary citizens don't know enough, don't care enough, etc. So nobody speaks up for economic freedom, and therefore the state will interfere in every aspect of economic freedom. It tells you what you can produce and what you can't produce, how much of it you can produce, what input you can use. This is a case of interfering in the input, right? Saying you can't hire a person from Karnataka, but you can hire somebody from Kerala, and you can't hire somebody from here, you can hire, and it'll tell you what proportion of input you can use. It'll tell you, where you can sell, what you can sell, how much you can sell. It interferes in every aspect of the production process, of the consumption process, of the distribution process, right? Throughout. And we don't seem to be giving enough attention to this. And the result of all of that is, whether we know it or not, subdued economic activity, which again results in unemployment. So all of this is, symbolic of that, right? And then, of course, the license inspector Raj, as you said, is
it's a symptom of this larger cause.
It is, I mean, it's a funny outward, symptom which you can recognize, but it is that, right? When you're saying you have to come, even our GST filings is such an elaborate process. I mean, I don't want to get into that, but it's not easy, right? And so similarly, now this, look at that. It's nothing but paving the way for some extremely rich officials in the Haryana government. That's what this will lead to.
No, at least from a constitutional law standpoint, I want to come in here and, just lay this out that, of course, there is a fundamental right to free trade, business and occupation given to every citizen in the country. But restrictions, or rather reasonable restrictions, can be placed in the general interest of the public. Right now, when the ground for restriction itself is so vague and broad, then anything and everything passes as a restriction on these fundamental rights. And our courts have been very reluctant to sort of enforce the private rights of individuals when it comes to this particular fundamental right.
Right. So when I was writing this piece, I frantically messaged you and saying, what about economic freedom? And you said, Constitution does provide it, but with about like 3 pages of caveats.
That's right.
And so that immediately, dilutes it so much.
A lot of these caveats were also, in fact, added during the 70s when Indira Gandhi was about nationalizing left, right, and center, right? So, of course, there are too many exceptions to it. So
no right, only left.
That's right. So, I mean, even in recent times, I can think of one judgment of the Supreme Court where they actually struck down a restriction the RBI had placed on banks from dealing with crypto exchanges and said that, this is a violation of your right to free trade and business and so on. But after that, this is a good example where Punjab and Haryana High Court seemingly has stood up for the rights of the employers in this case.
Correct. And I mean, my heart was brimming with joy when I read the judgment where they very clearly says, we cannot envisage any situation in which you can direct employers as to who you can hire and so on, right? Which is good. I mean, I'm so glad that they're taking this. But see, I have a question for you. Should we rely on, on one end, we go on about how judicial activism is bad and, why is it that courts are doing this, etc., right? And then we moan about that, about judicial activism. I mean, there's not really judicial activism in the strict sense where they didn't take it up suo moto, etc. There was the Chamber of Commerce who went there and so on. But should it have gone to the courts? Should this not have been, nipped in the bud at the legislative assembly stage where, you should have had decent opposition, where there should have been feedback, where there should have been, the court should be the last resort, right?
Ideally, but this was essentially, the political support was fully there for this law across the aisle, right? Even recently in Bihar, when the assembly passed the law increasing reservation for certain categories, I think there was overwhelming support. And
because nobody wants to be seen to be against it, right?
Yeah.
It will put you in such a soup as saying,
Yeah.
not only are you not doing something like this, but you're opposing the
Yeah.
people who are doing it.
And same goes with economic reservation when it was passed in the parliament in 2019, I believe.
Yeah.
I think almost every party voted for it. And same goes for reservation for women, which was passed in a few months ago,
Right.
for reservation in the
33%,
parliament,
huh?
33% reservation. There was overwhelming support, right? So I think there is a political consensus over such populist measures, and that is hard to be disturbed.
Yeah.
So
I don't
court
think it's
becomes
political consensus, but that's what, as I said, right? You can't be seen to be
holding out.
I mean, in something like this, then, people will just say, we could have done such great things if not for you, right? So, yeah.
That's true. And that's why I think courts become the final one and only arbiter of such disputes.
Which luckily don't have,
Yeah.
or may not necessarily always bow down to political pressure or
May not.
populist
Yeah.
demands.
So anyway, before we close, Anupam, there was one small related aspect which I thought you could shed some light on, which is, regarding interstate relations in the country when it comes to all these things, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to labor, when it comes to goods and service supply, trade, commerce, and so on. Of course, India is supposed to be one unified market, but we have had so many barriers between different states, right? And I would like to sort of divide them broadly on input and output barriers. Earlier, we had a lot of these output sort of barriers where, there were a bunch of taxes, cascading effect, and so on, which GST was supposed to solve. And it has, to a great extent, reduced the overall tax incidence and so on. But now this new sort of trade restrictions or labor market movement restrictions have come in the shape of, say, local reservations, right? Now, as you have written also, this is a slippery slope because this only gives incentives to other states to act in a similar way, right? So when we think of India as a union of states, what does it mean for, say, economic freedom and free movement of labor and capital and goods and services across the territory of the country?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is probably one of my pet peeves. I mean, bigger than a pet peeve, really. But
you have a lot of pet peeves.
I have a lot of pet peeves. But no, I've had a very serious gripe about this, that I think India did or has done reasonably well as a union of states when we speak about it in political terms. Yes, you have the odd, I want to separatist movement, or you might have an odd
militancy or something,
etc., etc. But I think largely, the states have remained together. The identity or nationhood of India is quite strong. So I think we've done well on that count. And this is what in many ways was, an inspiration to even things like EU, etc. How can they achieve, that kind of integration of different states? But now you speak about economically, right? I think we're doing very, very poorly. For especially a country which has had such great integration politically, I think on economic terms we do very poorly, right? As you said, throughout history, just the idea of movement of goods from one state to the other has been very difficult, and that's largely due to local taxation laws, etc., which, as you say, has been solved to a great extent by the GST. There's still some problems, but I think we're getting there, right? I mean, I think GST solved that, but there are a whole bunch of other problems which has not been solved in terms of economic union. So it's far easier now for a French passport holder to move to Germany, get a job, buy a house there, buy a car, buy whatever, and drive it around, than it is for some similar thing of one person from a state in India to move to another state, right? And I think that is a damning indictment of our economic integration, right? You can't, for example, there are so many states which have very severe restrictions on buying property. I can't buy a property in, for example, Sikkim. I can't buy property in Himachal Pradesh. I can't buy property in Jammu and Kashmir, right? A whole bunch of these things, right? Erstwhile Jammu and Kashmir, the state. I don't know now, Union Territory, probably I can. So there's all such restrictions. Northeast states, hilly areas, I can't. There's reserved areas and so on. That's about buying property. Now moving you can, technically move and be anywhere, but again, if there are restrictions on where I can do a job and where I cannot, that again is a restriction, right? That's a very severe restriction. There are severe restrictions on, on really stupid things. You can't. The car thing for me is idiotic. You've paid road tax here, and now let's say you're permanently moving, you'll have to shell out like a lakh or two to make that registration and move happen, which shouldn't be the case. I mean, it's a car. You've already paid in one place. It shouldn't be that difficult, right? And so on and so forth. You can think of so many other things. From one university to another, you need a no objection certificate. I remember when I applied to some Maharashtra university some time back, St. Stephen's or no, whatever, St. Xavier's, which I go. I realized it's such a headache. I'm like, forget it, right? So all of these things, it happens, but there's just friction. There's friction, continuous friction, right? Oh, that's not great. And you can think of, for example, even movement of goods, right? Movement of goods between, I don't know, Luxembourg to Spain happens much, much quicker than it is from Bombay to Bangalore on road, right? There's been studies which have conducted, from, don't quote me on this, but, there's from two similar kind of distance points in China versus India, right? And in China, it happens in like a day or two, whereas in India, Mumbai to Delhi takes even now up to 11 days for movement of goods on a truck. Right now, I'm not talking about a flight, on a truck. And whereas in China, that thing happens in one day. So I think these are all kind of barriers to greater economic integration. And the other famous example is, you don't, for example, if you're living in Delhi, you can't get good banana chips from Kerala. That market doesn't exist. Whereas you can get it in New York and you can get it in London. Right? You can get good quality, authentic Kerala banana chips in New York easier than you can get it in Delhi. Right? I don't even want to talk about how bad masala dosa is in Delhi, but that's a separate problem.
And how overpriced.
And how overpriced it is. Right? But that is a lack of economic integration. How often do you find genuine good products from, let's say, Mizoram in India, in Bangalore? You don't. That market is dead. Whereas if that market was alive, if there was good economic integration, that would benefit the people of Mizoram massively, right? And probably, and I'm stretching a leg here, but you wouldn't even have internal conflicts as you are having in Manipur. If economic opportunity, if it was a good, thriving economy. So I think there are lots of such problems, and you need to think about how can we integrate India truly into one large economic area.
Thanks a lot, Anupam. But as a parting note, I really want to point out the observation was the Punjab and Haryana High Court made in this decision, striking down the local reservation law. It sort of interlinked the three fundamental rights that we have, right? So under the Constitution, all of us have the right to free movement across the territory of India, right to free settlement in any place within the territory of India, and the right to, of course, carry on your trade, business, or occupation, right? And it sort of said that all of these three are interlinked, like one is dependent on the other. The local reservation law not only impinged on your right to get a job, but also it impinged on your right to move and settle in any territory of the country, right?
Correct.
So that sort of a view, I think, is very positive and sort of can give us or lead us into a framework where we talk of economic integration of the country in much more minute details. But thanks a lot, Anupam, for joining me on this fascinating chat today, and hope to have you back on All Things Policy again.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.